Coming up on tonight's episode of Faith versus Culture, a rebirth in the belief of God. A great conversation with Justin Brierly coming up next.
Having sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. My name is Dan Andros. I am managing editor with CBN News and joined as always by Billy Hallowell. Billy, what's going on?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for, today's episode and conversation because we're going to be talking about some of the maybe positive patterns or the things that are happening that maybe people aren't aware of in the faith space.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's always this back and forth here that you hear on the one side, well, everyone's going away from faith, and well, then we've got revival. And so you hear both sides of it. And so our next guest today has his take on it. And I'm really interested to see it, given especially his background and all of the various people he's talked to over his career.
Yeah, and so our guest is Justin Brierly. He's the former host of Unbelievable, and he's a prolific author and just an amazing all-around guy. How's it going today, Justin?
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, Billy. Great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Well, thanks for coming on. And we're here to talk about a number of topics, but the big subject we're going to be covering is your new book. And I love this title, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. Wow, there's a lot there in that title. And I think people look at the culture, they look at the chaos, and they might hear that and they might say, well, what is this rebirth? Is there a rebirth of belief? And so I'll throw that to you.
Well, I think there is. Sometimes it's hard to say that it's a kind of something that's overwhelming us at this point. I think it's something that's almost going on at a kind of cultural level quite high up. And sometimes it takes a while to feel that further on downstream. But actually, really what I noticed was, I've been hosting conversations between Christians and atheists for many years. And I just noticed that those conversations were changing in recent years. What had once been the kind of combative debates between new atheists and Christian thinkers were increasingly being replaced by conversations with secular thinkers still, but who were much more open to the Christian faith, to the value it brings to culture, and kind of concerned in a way at the way in which culture is turning into the culture wars and things, and the way in which there don't seem to be any answers to that. We're seeing a meaning crisis in the West. And I guess just asking big questions about whether actually we do need something like Christianity that once held people together. So this is where I've seen the conversation changing. And that doesn't mean that sort of everyone's suddenly about to become a Christian, but I do think there's something's changing in the atmosphere, and that's what I'm writing about in the book.
Yeah, and you've obviously had a front row seat to many of these debates, and as a Christian, I'm sure first of all, I commend you for just sitting there with a straight face sometimes as a Christian and hearing some of these, some of the views and not wanting to jump out of your seat. I don't think I'd be able to contain myself as well as you did listening to some of the atheists, but you do a really good job of letting them explain their views. So but I wanted to back up a little bit. Can you talk about what exactly like the new atheist is versus just standard atheism before we get into like all the implications of how that's changing?
Well, atheism, non-belief in God, has obviously been around for a long time, but new atheism was a kind of new incarnation of that in the mid-2000s. It was a very strident, anti-religious form of atheism, led by people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. These were the horsemen of new atheism. They all had best-selling books against religion, and it kind of resulted in a whole movement, especially led online, lots of rallies, conferences, and in a sense, a really strident anti-religious tone in the media as well. So that was kind of what the new atheism was. It even had in our country, the UK, a bus campaign which said there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And maybe the high point of it in the US was the Reason Rally in 2012, where a lot of people turned out on the Mall in Washington, D.C. to kind of champion science and reason. But what I say in the book is really that I think that movement, to some extent, has really come to an end. In fact, all of the new atheists are now no longer talking about religion. Actually, they've all effectively taken up sides in the culture wars. And I was so interested to see so many of these new atheists sort of architects actually falling out with each other in the end. A lot of the movement kind of unraveled under its own weight. And a lot of them got a lot more concerned with what was happening in the culture than their concerns with fundamentalist Christianity and that kind of thing. So the whole kind of thing started to change in the last several years. So that I would say the new atheism now, as I say in the title, has grown old. It's not really a movement that many people consider a live one any longer.
Yeah, you're pinpointing something really interesting. I went to the Reason Rally to cover it, and I was there. And you look at that event, and that was the pinnacle, I feel like, of everybody coming together in that movement. And you really got this sense, it was like an evangelistic sense they were evangelizing one another and bringing people in. And to think that just a decade later, you would have some conservative Christians in agreement with Richard Dawkins on certain cultural issues is remarkable. I never would have guessed that or saw that coming. What do you think it is that led to that decline? I mean, to have such a big movement get to that point and then to sort of end up where we are now, what precipitated that?
Well, I think there are a number of things. I think, firstly, the culture itself got slightly bored of the new atheism, if I'm honest. I think it started to sound almost quasi-religious itself because it was so kind of strong in its rhetoric. It had the high priests of the new atheism. It had religious texts. It had a sort of orthodoxy, which was scientific materialism, and it had its heretics. So I think some people just got fed up with the kind of the religiosity almost of the new atheism. And eventually I had more people kind of dissociating themselves from new atheism who were non-Christians than kind of for it. But I think also, as I say, it kind of just started to crumble under its own weight. And it's interesting you say that, you can see conservative Christians as unlikely bedfellows now with Richard Dawkins on certain social issues like transgender is the one he's been speaking on particularly recently. And that for me is symptomatic of what's happened around the new atheism, because what happened to the new atheism was that it had all these internal disputes about precisely these kinds of issues. There was one wing that wanted to be pro-LGBT, trans rights, feminism, and so on. And they wanted to take the movement in that direction. And there were others who were really concerned by that and saying, no, all we need is science and reason. We don't need any of this political ideology with our movement. And so that precipitated a huge split in the movement itself. And in fact, lots of these atheists no longer being able to share a stage with each other, lots of controversies. I mean, Richard Dawkins constantly getting into trouble for saying controversial things on Twitter and so on. And eventually, interestingly, there was a kind of a movement, especially for those who were concerned by the move towards woke ideologies, where they actually ended up realizing that Christians weren't necessarily their enemies. They were more their bedfellows. Another example of this is Peter Boghossian, who at one time was, a pin-up new atheist. He had written a kind of anti-religious book. He was this Portland philosophy professor. But when I contacted him a few years ago to take part in a debate on my show, he politely turned it down and said, Justin, I'm no longer debating religion because there's this much bigger thing that I'm worried about. And I actually see Christians more as my allies than my foes now. So he had a complete change of heart as to what battles he wanted to fight. And I've seen that time and again, actually. So we're living in a very different cultural context when the new atheists, are often actually more on side with some Christians than against them.
Very interesting stuff. We are talking to Justin Brierly. He's got a new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. We're going to have more with Justin on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. We'll be back in just a second. All right, we are back on this episode of Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros here, along with Billy Hallowell. We're joined today by Justin Brierly. And Justin, you mentioned something last segment, a phrase that really kind of piqued my interest. You said there's a meaning crisis right now. And I wanted could you unpack that a little bit? Because I don't know, that just really piqued my interest.
Well, the meaning crisis is something that's been identified by a lot of contemporary scholars, psychologists, secular thinkers. And essentially, it's a sense of alienation that people have There's a sense in which our culture, as it's lost the Christian story in the West, which once gave people a sense of identity, common purpose, and so on, it's been replaced by lots of different stories, lots of individual stories, lots of postmodern stories where people are essentially meant to find their own meaning, their own purpose, their own identity. And we've really seen this proliferate in the last, several years. Obviously, you've had a huge rise, especially thanks to social media, of all kinds of different identities that people can ascribe to, sexual and gender identities, but also all kinds of like political philosophies and everything else. And in many ways, what I see these, and other people have seen this as, is a kind of replacement for God. It's like the way in which people kind of fulfill that religious instinct in their lives, and it's by putting something as sacred in their life, and it might be their gender identity or their sexual identity or something else. And so there's that saying, isn't there, by Blaise Pascal, that we all have this God-shaped hole in our lives. But of course, the question is, can we fill it with these other things? And I think the meaning crisis is evidence that we can't, that actually these things do not ultimately satisfy, because they don't tell a true story about who they are, and they don't give us a bigger picture of how we're meant to live in this world. And so for me, what I see happening is I see psychologists like Jonathan Haidt and John Vervaeke and others, secular psychologists, talking about this meaning crisis. It kind of gives me hope that actually there's room here for the Christian story. And then I see other secular psychologists like Jordan Peterson, for instance, who's obviously become, a hugely well-known name in this area, often directing his young men who come to him for advice, who are looking for meaning and purpose in life, these kind of refugees from the meaning crisis. And where is he sending them? Well, he's sending them back to the Bible, interestingly. He's putting on huge lectures on the book of Genesis or Exodus. He's writing books like 12 Rules for Life, full of Christian wisdom, essentially. And I just find that really interesting. I think what we're seeing is that a lot of people are recognizing the Christian story still can be relevant for people who are looking for meaning and purpose. And actually, none of these smaller stories that we're telling ourselves are really doing the job in our contemporary culture. So I think the meaning crisis is kind of an identity crisis. And the identity people are ultimately searching for can only be truly found in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's really something I've noticed. It's very interesting among all the debates that are going on now. It's gotten, morality and different things we should champion and shouldn't have always been debated. Atheists have jumped in that, even though, a lot of people would say, well, you don't have a basis to jump in on it, and they do jump in on it anyway. But I think now, just in the last couple of years, the debates have gotten so extreme where basic truths are being challenged. I'm not a man, I'm actually a woman. And people are just, men can get pregnant, and you're saying these things, and it's like you almost don't even know how to argue them because they're so basic and they're so self-evident. How do you argue it? And I think, and this is just my assessment here, and I wonder, given all the conversations you've had, if you would agree that I think Christianity and God are the only way to really argue those things. And we're being forced into that direction, I think, by some of these cultural debates. Do you agree with that?
I do broadly agree with that. I think that it's come as a bit of a surprise, I think, to some of those new atheists I mentioned earlier, that having done, effectively the job of trying to take away the Christian story from the culture, it's actually left this void, and it hasn't been filled by some kind of logical, scientific rationalism. It's been filled by all kinds of other interesting beliefs. Quite often these kind of very postmodern, I can just invent my own reality kind of beliefs. And they've realized actually that's worse than what they were fighting against in the first place. And because you can't have an argument with someone who just says, well, I'm just going to reframe reality in whatever way I choose. And so that's why, as we were saying earlier, there's been some unlikely kind of alliances between Christians and atheists. And for that reason, I think this is an interesting moment, because as we kind of lose, in a sense, a purchase on reality, as people kind of go off in all kinds of different directions, I think there is going to be a kind of exhausted middle who are going to say, look, this is ridiculous. We if we can't agree on the basic terms of what it means to be a human, then where do we go? And I think it will push people back towards something that kind of, if you like, makes a foundation for life. I think the problem is that if you really believe, as the atheist claimed, that we live in a completely purposeless universe in which essentially you are just, a bag of chemicals floating around and you've got to make your own meaning and purpose, people will go in really weird, interesting directions when they do that. And I think what some of these secularists and atheists are realizing is actually we need something like the Christian story to make sense of who we are. You need something that actually gives people a kind of a story to live into. You can't just give them a kind of a blank canvas and just say, make it up as you go along, because then all kinds of crazy things will happen, you know, as people seek to do that. So I think it's interesting the way we're coming back to this idea that we need to have some kind of a sense of who we are, a story that makes sense of us. And yes, the Christian story has actually done that for millennia, for many generations of people. It's been highly successful. The Western culture is basically based on Christian principles. And I think, you know, it just about now, as things start to, you know, really fall apart in culture, it's only now that a lot of secular intellectuals are realizing just how powerful that story was and whether we should have jettisoned it as quickly as we did, you know, in the last few years.
Yeah, I have to ask you, shifting gears a little bit, when I look at your career and what you've done, more than anybody in an era where people are in echo chambers, they're only talking with people they agree with, bringing different people together, Christians and atheists, to have these conversations. You know, some people might say, gosh, did that challenge your faith? I'm curious. I'd love to hear from you. How has it impacted, maybe even grown your faith, refined your faith, to be the facilitator of hearing so many of these different conversations?
Certainly, you know, it was a wonderful privilege to be able to host so many conversations on The Unbelievable Show. And in a way, my faith really did grow. It was often challenged at times, but often I think it's through being challenged that our faith actually grows. And I came to appreciate actually through those conversations and having to hear and, you know, understand the pros and cons and the defenses of Christianity, that actually there is something really substantial here in the Christian story. There's an intellectual core that makes sense of it. There's a philosophical grounding to it. And so for me, I was really encouraged through the years of hosting these conversations. And I think we need to be open to that. I think we need to kind of take people's questions and doubts seriously. That's what I'm aiming to do in the new book as well. But to also find as Christians that actually the Christian story is big enough and strong enough to actually meet those and to have, you know, real honest dialogues and to actually provide fruitful answers. So I'm always encouraged actually when I come out of conversations, just you know, how well Christianity can do in the public square in that way.
All right. Well, Justin, I wanted to, why don't we wrap up here? We're getting close on the time. What would you like people to get from this book that you have out here? You obviously you have a lot of history, as we talked about with these conversations, and you've gleaned a lot of information. So what would you like people to get from this book?
Well, I've noticed that in recent years, there's been a kind of a lot of negativity and cynicism around the church. And I understand that fully because there's been a lot to regret in what's happened in certain forms of the church, celebrity culture and so on, that's led to falls from grace and all kinds of things. But sometimes I think we need a bit of an injection of optimism as well. And I hope this book is something like that, because actually, I don't believe God is finished with the church. I believe actually often we only see a small picture in our moment of what God is doing on a grand cosmic scale and through history. So I think the history of Christendom has always been kind of death and rebirth. And I think we are actually seeing as the book says, surprising rebirth of belief in God. I think we're just seeing the first signs of it. It's almost like the tide on faith is just about ready to start turning. But I believe that the church should be ready for that reason, to embrace people who are looking for meaning, purpose, and identity. And my hope is that this book will help to convince people that the tide is turning, that maybe we will see the revival of belief in God in our generation and a turn back towards the Christian story. Now, it may be that the church needs to change in order to be able to respond and to invite and engage people who are on that journey. But I believe God always does find the church that he needs to do that in every generation. And I just pray that we're going to be part of it.
Well, and I think that call there to be ready is so important for the church right now, especially watching so many of the revivals and all these mass baptisms happen. There's a lot of people there who need the truth. Justin, appreciate your time today.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks, Billy. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. All right, we're back here on Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros and Billy Hallowell just finished up our conversation, Billy, with Justin Brierly. And if you haven't seen his show that he's recently left, unbelievable. He did just such a fantastic job on that. So many great interviews and conversations and debates and things of that nature that he hosted. And he just does a really fantastic job. It's always enjoyable and enlightening to watch. And listening to him talk about his book, you get that same sense that you're just going to you're not going to get fluff there. You're going to get a lot of solid stuff.
Yeah, and you're going to get, both sides of an issue, right? That's so rare because of the echo chambers that we're all in. Yeah. As Christians, we should understand. We're not trying to listen to the other side so it converts us, but we're trying to listen to it so we understand what are they actually saying. It's very hard to argue or make a compelling case when you're not actually understanding where people are coming from. And so that's one of the amazing benefits of the work that he has done. And I think this book is really a natural continuation of that.
Yeah, it's so true. I think one of the things that's frustrating, if you're having a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you, is when they misrepresent your position. And so we don't want to do that on our side and then just tackle a bunch of straw men that we create and then slap down. There's really no value in that other than, preaching to the choir. You really want to be able to tackle the best arguments on the other side. And the best way to do that is to understand what they're saying their strongest arguments are for why they believe certain things. And then that puts you in a position to then appropriately address those claims. And so, Justin does a great job with that. And, I'm looking forward to checking out his book.
I am too. Yeah. And I think this rebirth of God, being ready, I think my big takeaway from this, be ready. The church needs to prepare because a lot of people might be coming in who have had an identity crisis, and you got to meet people where they are to bring them where they need to be.
Yeah, I loved that explanation of the meaning crisis that we have. I think it's so true. And it's more evident now than ever with things like the gender conversations we're having right now, men can get pregnant, et cetera, as we talked about. So, that was a great one for me, that meaning crisis. He really articulated that well. But all right, make sure you check out his book, Justin Brierly's book, once again, which is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. All right, we're going to be back. Close it out. This is Faith versus Culture. Back in a sec. Well, thanks so much for watching this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. As always, don't forget to check out the Quick Start podcast each and every weekday morning at 7 a.m. Billy, myself, and Goins-Phillips, we are getting through the news of the day from a Christian perspective. Hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you back here next week. God bless.